So
Yes,
my
hello
topic.
everyone. Sorry. Hello everyone. Welcome to Systems Development Frameworks. I don't want to interrupt you, Atanas. Just that the people who would watch the video later on know, okay, it's one of those lectures of HTW. Welcome to this lecture again, another episode, and I'm very pleased. Atanas just now has told us he has a lightning talk prepared, and I'm excited to hear something about native modules in Node.js. And yes, Atanas, your stage. I'm going to start the timer now.
Okay, cool. So today I'm going to be talking about native modules in Node.js, and I would like to start off with a quote by Atishay Jain, who is a JavaScript developer who works in Adobe, and he said, "As JavaScript developers, we are like astronauts. We fly up in space. We don't really care what happens down on Mother Earth, but sometimes we have to go down a layer into the world of unmanaged memory, segmentation faults, and multi-threaded architectures." Today I'm going to tell you why we need to write native code for Node.js, how we actually do it in a standardized way using an API, and I'm going to give you a hello world example. So there are three main cases in which you'd ever want to write native code for Node. The first one is when you want to directly talk to the operating system. And this is a problem which I stumbled on directly in my firm. So we were tasked with creating a web app in Node, which could configure network interfaces and authenticate users using Unix authentication. So this was on an embedded device, which was running Linux. And this is normally done by issuing system calls to the operating system. But the problem is you can't do that directly in Node. So we actually needed to write some native modules. So the second reason is you'd like to write native code. So you have a C++ library, you want to integrate it with JavaScript, right? And the third reason is performance. So C++ is very, very fast. So actually native modules for TensorFlow.js is actually written with native modules. And now the question is, so how do we execute native code with Node? So an API is sort of the go-to way today. It's maintained as part of Node.js itself. And if you have Node on your system, you actually have a header file called napi.h. So you can always integrate it into your app. And it's cross-compatible between versions of Node starting from version 10, and it's completely independent of the JavaScript engine you're working on. So if it's V8, if it's JavaScript core from Apple, it doesn't matter. So it's actually a C library, which is quite verbose. So there's a C++ wrapper around it, which I've linked here. And I actually recommend you to use it if you ever will. So what you actually do is you write a native function in C++, right? You call it native function, for example, and you actually use this header file to wrap your function inside another function. But that function returns an API-specific types. And what an API does is it handles all JavaScript engine-related tasks for you, so you don't actually have to do that. You can just export a module, like literally how you do it in JavaScript. You can export a module, you can compile that module to a binary, which has a .node suffix, and you can then import it in your JavaScript code, which is really cool. And actually, I'm going to show you some code now. So on the right-hand side, we've defined a module in C++. So what you do is you include this in api.h file, and basically this whole CPP file is our module. Now what you need to have is an init function. So this is sort of the entry point later in our JavaScript code. And this init function takes in two parameters. It has an environment object, which actually holds global definitions that are defined in JavaScript, but not in C++. So for example, in C++, you don't have an undefined object. You don't even have a null object. And what env does is it basically, the environment holds these variables for you, which you can then use in your C++ code. Then you also have a second parameter, which is the exports. And this basically represents the functionality that our module is going to export when it is imported inside our code, right? In this case, we set a key value pair. We say we're going to export a function defined by the method, which is this function right here, and it's going to have a name of an API hello world. What this function does is it purely returns a string, which is world. And then the last line effectively registers our module with the given add-on name. What we do is we effectively compile this using a specific build system. which generates that binary, and we can literally include or require, in this case, our binary in JavaScript code. And we see here, the name was add-on, we have an add-on here. So we then export this function that we've defined, which is an API hello world, and we can then use it in our JavaScript code as defined in the CPP module. So I just wrote some tests, right? So I require my bindings, meaning my function. I then assert that it's defined, and I then call it, and then I receive the world example here. So I assert that the return string was world, and then I make sure it doesn't throw any exceptions, and I console log that the tests have passed. So this is sort of your main way to write native modules today in JavaScript. And that's it, basically. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
So thank you very much for this amazing lightning talk. That was great, very interesting. You are right on time. I think 10 seconds over time or something. It's perfect. Yeah, as Atanas has said, questions.
Yes, so when you install Node.js on your system, you actually have this. It comes with Node.js. It's supported by Node.js. It's maintained by Node.js. It's actually there.
Yeah, and you could also always repeat the question, because people just don't understand who watch the video later that you're actually reading something from the chat. So the question was, so you mean I have this header by default? Yeah.
That's a good point.
So Yuri is typing something. In the meantime, I also have a question. I find this very interesting. I never did that before. Can you share a screen again, please?
Yep.
I never did that myself, like trying to do something with native code. Yeah, exactly. This slide I'm interested in. So the file on the left side, build release native, that's a binary. Like,
right. So I'm using a specific build system which is called Node GIP. So there are different systems with which you can compile this C++ code into a binary that is compatible with Node. And the standard one is called Node GYP. I should probably link that as well. And what it does is effectively creates a build directory in your project folder, which is either a release or a debug, whatever you feel like. And it creates this binary which has this .node suffix. Now, I actually checked what it has. It's a pure binary. It's basically a blob. I can't extract any information from it just by looking at it, but I can somehow magically require it into my JavaScript file, and I get my Node module.
Yeah, that's this magic is especially that what I'm interested in. If I would use any other language aside of C++, let's say, I don't know, Rust or something, that would also be my target, right? So I also output some binary, and this binary will be imported on the left side in the same manner.
Well, I'm not sure, because this build system actually takes care of the magic, and as far as I know, it's only compatible with C and C++. So I don't know if it's going to work with Rust. I'm not really sure, but the standard way is you define your modules in C++, and then you actually provide a library that is in JavaScript. So I could technically require this binary directly in a Node.js web app, but it's not considered good practice. So that's a tip. Just wrap your native modules always in an additional JS file, and then use that JS file to actually implement your logic.
Interesting. Yeah. Nice. More questions from the audience, maybe? So far, no. Okay, no one is typing. You can also unmute yourself if you have any questions. Well, if that's it, I would say again, thank you very much for your amazing lightning talk. Also, you can clap in the chat if you want. Nice. Great. So, all right. I'm going to continue on with our topic for today. That is Vuex and Vue-Apollo. Oh, I need to be the presenter. Yes, now I am the presenter. Now, since last lecture, we are more on the front-end side, right? So we have talked about Next, server-side rendering, and isomorphic code. And this, again, we are on the client side of things. And I decided to introduce Vuex and Vue-Apollo simultaneously somehow. They are comparable in the way that they both have a cache. Obviously, Vue-Apollo is, if you would think of Vue-Apollo, that's more like a client for GraphQL, like for GraphQL endpoints. So with Vue-Apollo, the primary goal, of course, is you want to get data from a backend. But they share one feature, and that is they control state that you have on the client side. And key bindings don't work. If you think of a Vue component, so this is a screenshot taken from the official documentation of Vuex. What you would have is you have your component and your template, and then you have like actions. So you click, for example, on the button. That would mutate some state or some computer properties or whatever, and the state or computer properties or whatever are in the template again, and then the template knows I have to re-render. That's the usual cycle for one component. And this is nice, and it becomes a little bit more complicated if you have multiple components sharing one common state. And you know already one way of doing that. So if you have a hierarchy of components, you can communicate to other components with events that go up the virtual DOM, and then you eventually reach your target component and re-render some state there. But Vuex is adding another a cache to your front-end application. And this is like the diagram with Vuex. So what you have is you have your components, and you have one or like multiple Vuex stores. And you would call from your Vue components, similar to the actions you would call, they call it dispatch. That's how components communicate with the store. And your actions could also request data from a backend, for example, or have promises and such. And when those promises are resolved, then changes to the state are committed to the Vuex store. And the concept is called a mutation. So the idea of Vuex is you track every change to a state within your front end in a mutation. And mutations are synchronous. So that means they don't have asynchronous code. And the asynchronous code must be in your actions. By the way, you can also, what diagram is missing out is you can also directly call mutations if you want from your Vue components. We come to that later. Those mutations mutate the state. And this will trigger a re-rendering of components that depend on the state. So in your Vue components, you have references to the Vuex state. And then the components, well, the Vuex state knows when the Vuex store knows when the state is changing. And it will automatically re-render your components. And then the whole cycle starts again. All right. One advantage of this is that if you have everything in one store, like any state that you want to track in your front-end code, you can debug this state because, for example, the browser plugin, Vue.js DevTools, show you a nice tab where you can see all the changes to your state. Not only that, you can also inspect the state and you can time travel between those different mutations. So you have one list of mutations which are run in succession, like one after another, and you can always go back and forth and see how your front end is going to change. We'll come to that later in the live demo. So the idea or the advantage of Vuex is easier debugging and being able to inspect the state of your application. You can have additional plugins which know of the state. It's like a specification or a standard that can be used by third-party libraries. It's also what should be noted is that this pattern is coming from Flux and React. So Vuex was, I think, inspired. I have never worked with React so far, but I think the equivalent library there is called Redux, and I think Redux is something like the simplified version of Flux. Flux is yet another library in React. I don't know. I have never worked with React, but just I know that from the documentation of Vuex, this was like inspired by those libraries. I guess a lot of you have worked with React and they know what it, like the names at least, what I'm talking about. So this is like the same pattern here. If you think of Vuex, what I have in mind is always something like that. I think in lecture number 1 or 2, we talked about Vue.js components and the virtual DOM. And then you have this hierarchy, like it's a tree. We have one parent component at the top, which will render other components, which in turn can have child components and so on. So a virtual DOM, like that's a tree. And you can communicate between those components along the edges of the tree. So a parent component can give data down to a subcomponent, and a child component can emit an event to the parent component, and that's how they communicate. If you want to connect to a child or like a sibling, let's say, you have this component is supposed to talk with this component, you can, for example, emit an event, and the parent component can then, I don't know, change data, which will then propagate to this component, and this will re-render. This is like the normal flow that you are already that you are familiar with. If you have Vuex, you add another dependency to your components. So since you mutate some state and a number of components might depend on this state, you have something like this here. So Vuex is something like a bus, so a piece which can communicate with many components at once, and there's no like multiple hops or something. So Vuex can basically communicate with all components in the virtual DOM at the same time, and it's also like a little bit bypassing the normal virtual DOM. And of course, another dependency. So that's why I'm referring to that's why I wrote this moral message down here, that if you use Vuex, you add also a lot of complexity to it. So if that's okay for you, then go for it. But I have seen many applications where people overuse Vuex when they could have used like a simple, if they, for example, just want to track state, which is only relevant inside one component, there's no need, for example, to use Vuex. Which brings us to the first don't. Do not overuse Vuex. I would say there's a rule of thumb when to use Vuex and when not. If you have state which is shared by many components, and if it's not persisted in the backend. If you have state which is only relevant inside one component, why use Vuex? You can do everything you want with mutating data inside your component, and that's it. And if you have state persistent in the backend, you can make use, maybe, for example, if you later on use Apollo client comes with its own cache. So if you get the data from the backend, you can rely on this kind of cache, and don't need to roll your own, basically. Does that make sense so far? Like, does that make sense here? Do you find this helpful? So, thank you very much. It looks good so far. Any questions in the chat? No, but one person is typing. So that's basically it. There's little to say about Vuex. It's probably better explained with a lightning talk. Can you give an example for the state? Yeah, perfect. That's actually what is on this slide. So here are some use cases for client-side state. For example, you have a form and you submit this form and you have a call to an API. And for the meantime, you want to have a loading indicator. And you want to have this loading indicator on multiple components. Then it's nice to, for example, save that into Vuex, right? So you just say submit, and then you tell the Vuex store, I just submitted the form, and you have a loading indicator. And maybe this loading indicator is somewhere globally inside the app. Another great example is authentication state. So if you're logged in, this is some kind of information that you most of the time want to use across the app, right? Is the user logged in or not? And then show certain components depending on that. So you would see a login button if you're not logged in, but you see I don't know, user menu if you are logged in with a logout button or with a link to your profile if you are. So there's another question, why not use storage, session storage? In theory, you can use whatever you want. There are many ways to achieve the same. I would say the reason to use Vuex is probably because it's standardized, or it's like a pattern, or it's like what a best practice, I would say. And if you do that, you get some other benefits, including the debugging features that I was introducing before. But yes, Vuex documentation itself says that you could do the same thing also without Vuex. So you can save your code wherever you want. The good thing about Vuex is that it also tracks, it also notifies Vue components if they have to re-render. So if you connect your components with Vuex and you say, I want the component to re-render when this changes, then you don't have to do anything. You just have to mutate the store, and then all components will depend on that, just re-render. If you roll your own solution, you would probably have to implement this reactivity on your own. And that's what you probably don't want to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't use Vue.js, I think. I mean, you can also implement the whole re-rendering yourself. Great, so you see, okay, nice. Questions has been answered. Yeah, just some screenshots. So this is a screenshot from Vue.js DevTools. This is how it looks. We will have a look into that later on. Yeah, this is the list I was talking about, and this is like the state, and you have mutations. So each of these lines are a mutation, and it's always showing you the current state of the state, and yeah, and you can always time travel. For example, there's a state and see how the application looked before it happened, and so on. So this helps you, or it's supposed to help you to to debug problems with state. As you know, state is the root of 90% of all bugs. So state is always a little bit error prone. So I guess it's helpful to have a common, I don't know, common pattern, common library that all developers agree on. If they want to track state, they put it into Vuex. Yeah, as I said, Vue-Apollo is not only the client library for GraphQL, but it also comes with its state, so with its cache. This is how it looks like. You can install another browser plugin, which is called Apollo Client. So whenever you are on the site that uses Apollo Client, you can use this browser plugin, and it will show you the Apollo cache. So this is Apollo Client is used also in, I think, in React and all other frameworks that use Apollo Client. And it's like included inside Vue-Apollo. So Vue-Apollo brings Apollo Client to Vue.js. Apollo Client looks a little bit different. Apollo Client is specifically designed to cache the data that's coming from a GraphQL backend. So you have a couple of tabs around here. So this is like an interactive GraphQL interface, the same that you see when you go to localhost 4000 and you see this Apollo playground popping up. So you can click on this tab and then have a console where you can just run any GraphQL mutation you want. It's tracking queries and mutations. So whenever you make a query to your backend and getting data from it, it's caching the data. And you can inspect this when you click on this. In the screenshot, I clicked on cache. So what you can see here is a root query, for example, list of all posts. And you can inspect the result of the data that was coming back from the query. And one thing that's really nice is that it's also cross-referencing items in the cache. So this is a root query, but you can also have like objects that were written. So Apollo Client understands the types because everything, GraphQL is a statically typed language. So Apollo Client can make use of that information and understands that you have a query called post, which will return a list of things that are all of type post. So this is why you have those 4 posts here. And after the colon, you see the ID. So apparently I seeded some posts with hard-coded ID, ABC, and then I created a post which on the backend would generate this lengthy ID, this unique ID. And yeah, by the ID, it can cross-reference objects. So if a post, for example, has an author, and I requested that object in the query, then this shows up here. And I can also click on this, and Apollo Cache would then understand, okay, this is actually this user here. And this is really, really nice, because what it means is that if you ever change this object, because the ID is always unique and will never change, and it's always identifying this object. If you, for example, make a mutation and you change the title of the post, the backend will return with the new post, but the same ID and the changed title. And then Apollo Cache can update the post. And everything in your Vue.js components, which depends on this particular post, will re-render. That's amazing. So you just have to send one mutation to the backend, and the frontend will automatically re-render those components that are showing the post title. If you request a post and you forget to request the ID field, then you basically disable this behavior. And we will have a look into that in the live coding, because then Apollo Cache will not be able to update the respective object. I hope this makes a little bit of sense. We will see this in the live demo. I think this is going to be much easier to understand then. I think this is my last slide. That's correct. So that's time. That means it's time for my live demo. So I'm going to show you Vuex first, and then I'm going to show you Apollo Client. So let's have a look. You should see my screen. And I have some demo code, which is here. And I also push this demo code to systems development. Come on. Systems development homework and to the demo branch there. So if you go to demo, then you should see this folder demo, which now not only includes the end, but also the app. And this is the demo code with some Vuex example. And yes, so this is a Nuxt application. Nuxt automatically includes Vuex. So if you go to Vuex Nuxt, then you will see that Nuxt has documentation for it, but you can also just search for Vuex. So this is the documentation of Vuex in general. This is a Nuxt specific documentation for Vuex. So let's have a look into the unspecific Vuex documentation in general. Here you can see the images that I borrowed, and then it's driver installation. You don't have to do this because it's automatically included in Nuxt. And I think the most important thing are the core concepts like what a state, getters, mutation actions, and so on. So you have this state inside a store. Where can I see it? Single state tree. All right, so maybe here. So you have a store and it has some kind of state. In this case, it has a property, and this property is a list. And then you can expose a getter. And this is what you would then import in your components. So any change to this state will trigger a notification to the components that depend on this state. I hope they have some documentation here. Yeah, so this is what you have in your component. You already know what's a computed property. And here they are returning something that's coming from the store. In this case, the getter's done to-dos count, which is this one here. So whenever the to-do list changes and changes the length, so if you, for example, remove or add to-dos, the component which is depending on that getter will re-render. All right. I have a demo for you, and you can, as I said, you can find this in the demo branch. And we have Nuxt has a folder called store, and that's where you put all your Vuex stuff. And every file here is a so-called module. So Vuex has this idea of separating the store into multiple modules. This is like this chapter. You can have a look, and Nuxt is like automatically coming with this approach. So every file in this folder store within a Nuxt application is automatically on a one module. So I have, for example, the module auth. And here I'm tracking things like if I'm logged in or not. And yeah, so I'm faking. I would have an API, and I'm using a token to send a request to this API. And I want to say I'm logged in if if the store has this token. For example, I have a getter logged in, which just returns if state token is set or not. So if this is falsy, then you will get false here. If this is something, then you have true, right? So logged in, I can use this getter in any component, and it will then listen to that state. For example, navbar. Here I have an helper called mapGetters, which is like adding a computed property. So you know this one here. So you can add your computed properties right there. And I'm using this helper mapGetter, so it tells me, okay, go to the auth module and map a getter there to a computed property called logged in. And then boom, I have a logged in computed property, and I show a button to log out if I'm logged in, or I'm just showing a piece of text when I'm not. You're not logged in. This is like the nav bar, so it's a component which lives on the top of a website. So let's have a look how this looks for real. So I'm going to my folder demo and going to web app and running yarn run dev, waiting for Nuxt to compile. Are there any questions so far? Yuri, can you have a look into the chat, maybe?
You are now unmuted.
This would be a great time for questions because it's like building. Okay, not anymore. So let's have a look. Localhost 3000. So it's showing me you're not logged in. I can inspect this with my Vue developer tools. So I have my navbar component, and navbar has Vuex bindings logged in false. The Vuex tab, which I showed you on the slides, is here. Here I have base state, that's like the first big initial state, and I have these, I don't know, pieces of data, and I have one getter, which is like the logged in getter. Like this is a method that can either return the state or return, I don't know. You can also compute values based on the state. We'll come to that later. In this case, it's just basically returning the logged in state, and that's it. So what happens if they log in with alexexample.org 1234 1234? Then it's logging in and saying, hello, Alice. And as you can see, there's now this log out button, and it's showing me something. If we inspect this a little bit further, you can see this. So I have a couple of mutations. Apparently, the set loading mutation is being called, then set token, set user, and then set loading again. And I can travel back to the specific times with, I think, this button here. Or maybe not. I don't know. Try again. Interesting. So this is actually the message that should show up when you're giving the wrong email password combination. So I have to admit, I didn't really test this out. Yeah. But at least you can inspect the state, right? So maybe should this make a little bit larger. So if you like step through the different mutations, you can see how the state is being mutated, right? Which is already something. Yeah, so let's log in for real.
Example.
Thank you. There we go. So this is nice. Yeah, I think this helps for a lot of use cases. And yeah, you can use Vuex when you have some kind of state that you want to reuse across a lot of components. For example, also when you have page transitions. And like I don't have pages right now, so this is just linking to the same page again. But if you have like page transitions, then and you have components and living on other pages, then you have like you can reuse the state there. How does it look? I'm going to show you how the source code looks like. Yeah, state. You know this already. So this is my initial state. State must be a function because it's being initialized on every request, otherwise you have a memory leak. And this is like just the initial state, and then you can define getters. So in this case, actually, this is doing something. So it's not only returning state token, but it's like casting this to a Boolean. This is odd. You probably haven't seen this this content thing, the way of writing it. Don't be afraid. It's the same as basically saying what's called set token, just as calling the method set token. For some reason, Vuex is explaining this here in the mutation section. There is apparently a naming best practice. Using constant Vue mutation types for mutations, you're supposed to use constants and put them into central location. And then you can use this syntax. So it's just a piece of string. and you import this in your store, and then you can use a particular JavaScript syntax feature. And well, for the reasoning, they tell you it can be helpful in large projects with many developers. And yeah, it allows collaborators to get an at-glance view of what mutations are possible in the entire application. And apparently it's also being a best practice in Flux implementations in general. Yeah, and exactly. Linters, apparently you can do static analysis. I haven't seen this so far, I must admit, but since I was preparing some demo code, I was following this best practice. Yeah, and speaking of getters, just to show you how it looks from the component side, I had navbar. So what you do is you say map getters, and this is for setting up a computed property. You can also have map actions. Map actions will always go into methods. One common problem is that you do something like this. This is a bug. Actions go into methods. And map state, so there is map getters helper, and there's map state helper. Map state helper, and those two go into the computed properties section of the component. And the syntax, maybe a little bit confused about the syntax. So this is spread operator. So map getters apparently is returning an object of functions, like key value pairs, and those are then functions. And so this is just spreading those functions into this object here. So you can easily add more of your custom computed properties if you have some, right? So you can have return whatever here. Yeah, you have. I think some of you have written computed properties already, and this is just a way of putting map getters somewhere here and then adding your own computed properties there. And this is here, the first argument can be the name of a module. Since this is already set up different files for different parts of the store, you can map this to like, you could reference you would usually reference it as auth/logged in. So that would be the name of the respective getter inside the store. But you can also write it like this, and this will be the array of getters in that store. There are other ways how you can reference those, either this way, that's how I did it. You can do it like this. Just have a look into the respective documentation. Now, let's come to mutations and actions. Mutations and actions can be distinguished by actions can be asynchronous, and mutations, yeah? Yes? That's a great question. So this is also something that Nuxt does for you. So Nuxt comes with Nuxt out of the box. And if you put some of those files into the store directory, it automatically load them and import them into Vuex. If you wouldn't have Vuex, then you would have to do this on your own. So you do this something like that, and you have create app, and then and there you use the store. When we discuss the testing, you have to do this something like that on your own. So this is what you would do without Nuxt. Nuxt is doing this for you, so you don't have to do anything. And then implicitly, it's all just there. So that's nice. So the second question was? Well, this here is just a fake. All right. So it's what's the question talking about? The demo code? Because I'm just faking the API. Where is it? Where's the API coming from? I'm a little bit confused right now. I thought I had like a folder where I have web pages, plugin static, store, components, assets. Strange. Don't I have a folder called API somewhere in here? So what is it like? I have to debug this a little bit further. But if the question is referring, going on, I want to open auth.js in the store. This API. Where's this API coming from? Sorry, I have to debug this a little bit. $API. So I think I made a small mistake in my demo code. I don't know why this has happened, but this $API was supposed to be like a fake API framework or library or whatever, and apparently I missed setting that up. There's a file missing which loads $API. Oh, there we go. All right. Now I understand why I didn't find it with git grep. Yeah, because it doesn't have the $. So you can. I was using a plugin and injecting a fake API method into Nuxt, and it looks like this. It's just a function. It's injecting $API. So this inject here is injecting $API across your Nuxt application, and that's where login is coming from. And it's basically just waiting 1 second and then checking if the password is 1231234 and if the email is one of those, and then it's telling you wrong credentials, or yeah, and that's also where the name is coming from, right? So this is just all faked. And yes, of course, it's if you reload this, it's gone. Or is it? Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah. But that's okay. It's just for like demonstration purposes, for demonstrating how Vuex works. That you can do something here, and this component set like changes the state, and suddenly that the thing up there is changing as well. So that's why I was doing this. You can persist the state of Vuex,
you are now muted.
but then you have to do extra work. So if you want to persist Vuex, then I think there is some kind of, there we go. There's some kind of library that helps it do this. Vuex plugin that enables to save the state of any persistent storage like cookies or local storage. There we go. Right. So by default, it doesn't do this, but you can do extra work, and then you can save the state into your, for example, local storage or cookies. Does that answer the question now? Sorry, I was confused.
You are now
by my
unmuted.
own code. Nice. The plugin is saving the store into a cookie or local storage. So a browser has local storage, which is here, it's empty, not being used. Example. I haven't looked into Vuex persist. I just Googled it right now because there was this question. Of course, but then you have to do this work on your own. As I said, like there are multiple ways, and this is just already implemented for you. So why not use it? Of course, you can save it to local storage, but then you have to like get it from there somehow. But we're not at Vue. We are not talking about Vue-Apollo so far. We're just talking about Vuex, right? No Vue-Apollo in this demo code. Okay, maybe there was some confusion on his side too, because we're not talking about Vue-Apollo at all. Like in the slides, I was comparing the two because they both have a cache. But right now, I'm not. Like I haven't showed you Vue-Apollo yet. All right, so now let's go to testing. I have to speed up a little bit because I want to talk about Vue-Apollo. In fact, if you have, as I said, Vuex is adding another dependency, right? So this means you have, when you do testing, you have to provide this dependency. Let's run the test for a second. Run test. So this is running the login form spec.js, which I have opened in my editor. And now you have to set up an additional piece, like an additional dependency, right? And the way how it works is documented. So we are using Vue test utils. And what you have to do is you put that into your search engine and you say, or Vuex, Vue test utils and Vuex will bring you to this chapter of the guide, and it's explaining you how you can test your components with Vuex. So either you want to test components that are using Vuex or are depending on Vuex, that's this part. Or what you can also do is you test the Vue store directly. Let's say you have a complex store. So, I mean, this doesn't look too complicated. But let's say you have a more complex implementation, then you can test those functions also. And that's what this chapter is about, right? So depending on what you want to do, you can either do this. I guess most of you want to test components that are using the store. And you are probably most interested in how can I add this dependency to my Vue test util tests that are testing a component. In this case, we are testing a component which is called actions view, right? It's coming from components. And the way how you do it is you use create local view, which is helper coming from this library to not pollute your global view object when you add plugins. And so you get this local view thing, then you have a local view instance, and then you call use Vuex. So Vuex is a library, and this is injecting this dependency into your local view object. And this local view object is being added to calls of shallow mount. You know shallow mount already, you know mount already, you give it the component and some options. And you can also give it a local view instance object, which has the Vuex library injected, right? Another thing that you can do is then you have a store, and there you add some mock actions, right? Actions, and I forgot to explain that to you. So mutations and actions change the state, right? Getters are the readers, and mutations and actions are changing the state, and actions can have asynchronous code, and mutations must be synchronous. For example, here I'm using an action for login because I'm having a promise, right? It was waiting for 1 second. So if you look closely, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I hit login, it takes 1 second to log in. And that's because I told it to wait for 1 second, right? So I'm waiting for 1 second here. So when this method is called, this is asynchronous. It's like a fake API call. It's like waiting for 1 second. So that's why if you have API calls in your actions, if you want to change state asynchronously, you must put it into an action. And actions are also being imported in your components in the same way. So you can have map actions. By the way, here's an example how to use map getters and map state. So if you just want to map the state directly without the interaction of a getter, you can do the same thing. But yeah, and here's an example how you can have another computed property. So this form is having a valid computed property, which is testing if I typed in something. Now it's valid, right? And oh yeah, it must be an email address. Fair enough. And this button is listening on whether the form is valid or not. If the form is not valid, it's being disabled. Right? Nice. Just an example how we can own computed properties with those coming from the store. So here we have map actions, and so this is going into methods. And I have an action called login. So then I can say this.login, right? So login inside the component is mapped to an action on the Vuex store. So submit is what is being called in the button. Oh no, when I submit the form. When the form is submitted, then it's calling the action coming from the store with form data. Right? So, and then it's like mutating some store over there, and that's it. So obviously I have to mock these three things here: map getters, map state, and so on, if I'm making a component test. And this is how it looks. So you have local view, you inject Vuex, and then you have to set up the store. Since Nuxt is already coming with modules, you have to put this into a key called modules. This is an object which holds the modules which have the same name as your files. And yeah, and you have to add this namespace thing, which is like denominating this object to be a module. And then you have to give it some fake state. I think it's even the same implementation as the real one, and some fake actions and fake getters. And those fake actions and fake getters can, of course, be set, hard-coded in your tests. In this case, I'm having a fake method, which is just returning false. And here I'm having a mock function, which is like pretending to be a function which is returning a promise, which will resolve to the value true. And depending on that, I can, for example, test if I submit the form, it shows no error because the login was successful, and the login is successful because my login action was returning true. So this is like the way of mocking this action. So if this action is returning true, the form believes, oh, cool, login was successful. But I can simulate the same thing. It's returning, in my implementation, this login thing is returning false if the login was not successful. Or is this actually true? It's also raising an error. Yeah. I have to look into it a little bit further. Maybe I'm talking a little. Maybe I'm a little bit confused. But the way how you can simulate is you just change this action login action. This thing here, this is like the action which is set into the store, and you mock the function when return something that you want. Like in this case, it's false, and then you should see wrong email password combination. Or if it's just a random error, for example, you have a timeout, right? You can make a timeout in component, then you can reject to an error, and then you should see something like, oops, something went wrong, try again, and so on. So this is what you can find in this demo code. I hope this was helpful. This is actually it. This would be a great time for answering questions. Any questions?
You are now unmuted.
Here's the store. Here are the component tests. What you saw in my editor just now. Is everything so far so good? If so, then I'm going to check out my reference solution for the last exercise, for the most recent exercise. And now this is the time where we switch to Vue-Apollo. All right. So until now, only Vuex. Now we start with Vue-Apollo. So in the example or in the homework exercise, I'm asking you to use Nuxt-Apollo. Nuxt-Apollo is a Nuxt module which will import Vue-Apollo. Right, Nuxt module to use Vue-Apollo. Vue-Apollo is the Vue.js plugin to use Apollo client. There are alternatives. So I think in the homework,
You are now muted.
Yeah. Come on. In the homework exercise, I'm referencing another option. So you can use Vuex-Apollo, but there's also like another, I haven't used this so far, Nuxt GraphQL request, but this one is just a GraphQL client which doesn't come with a Vue-Apollo in order to save, in order to get a smaller bundle. Simple and lightweight, so it doesn't include, as far as I understood the documentation right, it was using, yeah, I think it's not using Apollo client, so it's saving some size in the bundle. So if you don't want to have this caching, you can use this one. And I don't know, if you want to implement the cache yourself, you can, for example, just use plain Vuex as you saw, right? So use either this or this, Vuex-Apollo. I was using Vuex-Apollo. And because we're using Vuex-Apollo, we need a GraphQL endpoint. And that's why I'm not only starting the front end, but also starting the backend. So I have the backend up and running. So many typos today. Here. This is what you know already. And now I also have the, okay, what's going on? Clear storage. Okay, cool. I have absolutely no idea what's going on. The browser maybe. Interesting. What? Clear site data. What's going on? Like, why does it work in Chromium? Why does it work in Firefox but not in Chromium? Anyways, okay. Goodbye, Chromium. So yeah, but we are still here. So I have my backend up and running, and I have my front end up and running, and I can go to my developer tools, and hopefully I have the Apollo installed. Yes, I have Apollo installed in my Firefox, and I can inspect the cache now. It's awesome. Yeah, as I said, we have those 4 tabs here. So this is like independent of Vuex and Vue. I have an interactive Apollo like playground where I can run arbitrary queries. I can see what queries have been sent to the backend already. That's this one. So you see a number of posts. And in order to get those posts, I send this query to the backend. So far, no new mutations. That's going to change if I click on upvote. So you could see that upvote is adding a vote to the post. And Apollo client is caching those mutations as well. So here you can see what mutations I was sending to the backend. In this case, I have this upvote mutation, which has a variable, and the variable was just the ID of the post. I can also create postings, and then it will send another mutation. And now what's really great is that I can also inspect all those objects that I have in my cache. In this case, I have just like users and posts. So users write posts, and they can vote posts. So I have my root query, of course, which is the post query, and I can inspect the data that was coming from this query. So this post query is returning posts, and when I, for example, navigate between pages, it can load this data from the cache, which is nice. If you click on other pages and then you come back and you saw this already, it's already showing the cache. In the meantime, maybe sending a new backend request, and then re-render the page when the new data is there. So it has like a really like sophisticated caching already implemented for you, which is really nice. And you can inspect those objects that are coming from the backend. As I told you, they have cross-references. So this is like the post that I just created. You can see this because the ID is somehow different. It's not seeded. And I can click on this user, and because it knows about the IDs, it knows that this is the user with the ID 1, right? Which is, in this case, it just has the ID, and that's it. So I was never requesting anything else from the backend. So I know that the user 1 has also a name attribute, but apparently I was never requesting this from the backend. Because, post was just, there you can see. Yeah, so I requested author and ID and nothing else. This is automatically added. So I could request name, and then it would show up here in the user. So Apollo client always knows what objects have been queried from the backend and can list you the attributes. And what is really nice is that you can just send a mutation, for example, in this news item component. If I click on one of those buttons, for example, upvote. Upvote is really just doing one method call and nothing else, right? So this is like the upvote post mutation. I can show you where this is coming from. It's being imported. It's being imported from GraphQL mutations. So I just added a folder GraphQL in my Next application, and I have 2 files, mutations and queries. And in this case, it's I'm having all my mutations here in the mutations file. And I'm exporting those, right? Just to give you an understanding. So this is upvote post. It's just this mutation which I want to send to the backend. So all I do is I have a reference to this $Apollo. When I have Next Apollo installed, I can call this $Apollo from my components, and it has a method called mutate. And all I have to do is give it a mutation, optionally add variables, in this case, the ID of the post, because the upvote post mutation has variables. So this here, this is a variable which is being used here. Many of you don't know how to do that, by the way. I had to tell a lot of groups how to use the variable side queries and mutations. So you have that, then you have to give it the variable. And I'm giving the variable here. So this ID refers, like this is setting this variable. This is like the item is the post. The component is called news item, so that's why I called it item. And this is everything I have to do, right? So I don't have to do anything with the result, like I don't have to wait for the backend. Apollo mutate, that's it. And when the result is there, Apollo cache will automatically update the respective post with the new votes. So this is downvoting it, and this is now even more downvoting it, and I can upvote it. And you can see like a number of mutations, downvote, and it's always like returning the data from the backend. So if I go to network analysis, you can see that the votes are coming from the backend. It's always updating it immediately. And that's because I'm always requesting the ID field. So Apollo client knows how to update the cache. So you can see something is happening here. I can prove that to you by simply not requesting the mutation. By simply not requesting the ID field. For example, when I downvote, let's just remove that. Now, the upvote still works, but the downvote will not change anything anymore because Apollo cache is not able to update the cache because it's missing the ID. Right? So you can see that the post is being sent, and you can see the votes is going down, but you still see the old votes here, right? So this is, I think, one of the best things in Apollo and Vue-Apollo. It's like automatically updating my components, and I don't have to do anything anymore. Does that make sense? This would be also a good time to ask questions.
You are now unmuted.
Yuri, can you please say me if there's no questions? Yeah, so that's the reason why you should always return, when you do a mutation, you should always return the thing that's going to be updated as a return type. And if you are the client, you should always request the ID field, because then you utilize this automatic caching. So when you mutate or when you update one thing, it automatically updates the cache. So what happens if you, for example, create or delete something? Then you have to do a little bit more, right? So you have delete post and you have write post. And if then data is coming back from the backend, then Apollo doesn't know where it should add or remove data from, because the ID is either completely new in case if you create the item, or, well, it doesn't know that it has been deleted, right? Because Apollo client doesn't know that this is going to, like, this is supposed to remove something, right? It's just a name and it doesn't know that it's being deleted. So in that case, we have to do a little bit more. We go to the news item. Then you can see that when I remove something here, then I have this so-called update hook. The update hook is being documented in Vue-Apollo. Somewhere. So mutations. Yes, there we go. It's right there. So mutations are queries that change your data state on the Apollo server. And what's really nice is if you call mutate with a mutation, might be some variables. When the mutation is receiving data from the backend, you can then update the internal cache of Apollo client. So that's your store. That's like a reference to the cache. And that's the response from the backend. So they send an add tag mutation, and then the data, as you know, is in data : add tag. So this is the whatever is coming from the backend as like the data that was returned. And then they can update the result of another query, right? So this Apollo client, as you already know, also saves queries and mutations. It's caching them, right? And you see them also in the cache. So that's why you see here root query, root mutation. These are the respective cached queries or mutations. And you see this list. And you can update this list in the cache. And then if you have a component which is like rendering everything from this query here, and if you from somewhere add another item here, it will always automatically show up there. So you don't have to do anything anymore, which is, I think, amazing. And this works like this. So you have, this would already work. Why not? Let's remove this just for demonstration purposes. Oh, come on. Yeah, whatever. Delete this as well. All right, if I remove something now, it doesn't add anything, but if I refresh the page, it's gone, right? Because then the query will be it will re-trigger the query. However, if I undo this, when I remove now something here, it will remove it automatically without a page reload, right? Because it knows I was showing the content of this list here in this component. And the magic how this is working is that you have this update method here, where you have this store and you have this data which is coming from the store. And then you can say something like read query, that's returning the data from like this list here. This is what's coming from read query. And then you can do things like filter, push, whatever you want. And then you can write the new data back into the cache. And that's doing the magic. And I think that's really, really amazing. Does that make sense? Yori, can you tell me if there are questions about that? Yeah, we'll come to the test later. I'm going to show you an example. I hope I have enough time because I have just 15 minutes left. Okay, so far so good. So you can see how you can use Apollo, and this also changes a lot how your components look like. Before, you maybe had like properties where you get the item from the list component and stuff like that. Or you have, I don't know, an app component which will like give you some data and then give that data via data binding to the news list component and so on and so on. With Apollo, this is different. As I said, it's like a global thingy which every component has access to. So you don't have to communicate via data bindings and properties anymore. But the news list itself is like having this query where it's getting data from with with just that. Like you just say in the script part of the component, you say Apollo, and then you reference this all post query, and then automatically you have a posts array. That's the data that's coming from the backend, right? This component here, for example, doesn't have any properties anymore. Before you had something like props, and then you could say, I don't know, posts top array required true, and then you would have to give the parent component would have to provide the data for this component, right? With Apollo, since this is like coming out from the cache, you just have to do this, and then you have a lot of magic going on. Another really interesting thing is reactiveness with Vue-Apollo, which you can see usage and view components, special options maybe. There we go. Reactive parameters. That's also something I want to point out. You should have a look into that one because it's amazing. So if your variables are not an object, but actually a method, you can change from your component those variables, and Apollo client will take care of reissuing this query for you automatically. That's amazing for example, pagination. Like you have a button show more, and then you click on it, and then you just increase the number of items, and then automatically you get some new data back. That's super awesome. Or filtering techniques, for example. You could actually, for example, also do the reverse ordering, which I do client side. You can implement like a variable in your backend, which automatically sorts the data for you. You could do the refresh this this list and resend a new query. So that's also really amazing here. That's working perfectly. I've used it many times. Now to testing. So this is the moment where I would show you how to do testing. I don't know why it's not opening my spec files. Any questions so far? All right, so with Vue-Apollo, there's also a documentation how to use Vue-Apollo testing. And what you basically have to do is you have to set the data manually, right? So Yeah. So when you, for example, have a component like news list, which has posts coming from a GraphQL query, then this is the moment where you cannot provide the data, the initial data with props data anymore, but with set data after you initialize the wrapper, because Apollo this is like the simulation of sending a query to the backend and getting some data back, and initial posts is what you get from the data from the backend back. In this case, I initialized it empty array. Here, I'm initializing it to something like, which is looking what like the actual data coming from the backend. So it has an ID, a title, and votes. And I set this data, and this must match. So this name here, posts, matches the posts that are being rendered in the template and the name of the property which Apollo is initializing. So Apollo, at some point after the query has been made to the backend, it's also setting this data, and this is how you can simulate that. Yeah, maybe this actually looks a little bit easier than the Vuex example where you have to set up the store. I don't know. Yeah, but that's actually it. Just say this, or you can, if you have to call mutations, you can mock $Apollo, for example, right? If I would, for example, test news item, which has this $Apollo mutate, I can mock Apollo and mock this mutate function and then return some data, and then see how my component is then changing. Does that make sense? Do they have an example? No, of course, because they're not assuming we use jest. Oh, they have. Okay, mutate. So mutate is going where? Yeah, so you have mount, and you can add mocks, and you can just mock an object called $Apollo, and there you have the mutate function, and it's doing nothing. Like, it's just not crashing when you call this $mutate, and that's it. Does that make sense? I'm almost at the end of the lecture. Something that's really important is still missing. And that is what I changed yesterday here, this part. So I ran, with my own reference implementation, I ran into a particular error with Next Apollo. There seems to be a bug, which is still waiting for being fixed. And there's already a pull request, which is like fixing this bug. And the bug is that you cannot use, you cannot parse the cookie where Next Apollo is saving the JSON web token. So I have a cookie. Oh, too large. Hey. Huh? Okay, but I can tell you that this Apollo token. I didn't see it. And this has the JSON web token. So this is how Next Apollo works. Next Apollo, it has documentation how it saves headers. So you can tell it how it, for example, use the how it should use how it should save a JSON web token, and gives you some helpers. This is a method that you can call when you have a successful login and you get the JSON web token. You can save that in the Apollo helpers. They call it $Apollo helpers. I believe that this $Apollo helpers is coming from Next Apollo. So I think this is not related to Vue-Apollo, but it's related to Next Apollo only. This is how you remove or how you delete this token. And this is how you can get this token in order to check whether you're authenticated or not. And this seems to be kind of broken right now. It took me a while to figure that out. And you can either, if you need this in server-side rendering. So the problem is in server-side rendering, the Apollo helpers doesn't really parse the cookie correctly, or the token. It's always undefined. In client-side rendering, everything works perfectly, but in server-side rendering, it doesn't. And this could be important because you see that I render a different page when you're logged in or logged out. This button is not there if you're logged out, and the downward and upward wouldn't be there if you would be logged out. So I can click on log out, and you can see how the page is changing. So when I do server-side rendering, I get this error again. Argument string must be a string. Great. What is going on? No. I don't know. Now my browsers are gone. I have only 2 browsers installed on my machine. What did I change? I didn't change anything. Do I have to start this again? Restart it maybe? This one maybe as well. Okay, in the meantime, I'm trying to explain you what's the problem. I wanted to show you that this page looks different for server-side rendering. And if you cannot parse the token, the server doesn't know if you're logged in or not, and it will always show you the page as if you were not logged in, or it will crash. And I was able to get around this with the hint that I showed you here. So I have my page, these buttons are showing up depending on my state. So I use Vuex to track the state if I'm logged in or not. And in order to have the state available or initialized on my servers in server-side rendering, I have to somehow parse the cookie in my like in server-side rendering directly, and then save that to the store. And then the store knows you're logged in, and it's going to render the page as if you were logged in. Nuxt server init is, by the way, that something that Nuxt adds to the store. It's a function that's being called when you request the page. So when you do this, which is not crashing, but it will maybe it's actually a bug, and it's related to that. So when you make a request to the backend, this will, on the server, run Nuxt server init. This is not part of standard Vuex, so this is a Nuxt-specific method, which you place in store/index.js, so right there, and it's being called only on the server, not on the client. And it's receiving, for example, the server-side context, which has the request, and inside the request, you can get the cookie from the header. And then you can save the authentication store. And then you give control flow back to the client. The server will respond with some HTML, and then the client can successfully do this. And yeah, doesn't look so good, actually. So this didn't happen before. Parse. It's indeed this here. What about so annoying. Hopefully. There we go. Nice. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, I just fixed something. Apparently, I have to update this in the homework description there. There's still like a bug when you're not logged in. Great. Okay. Maybe you should just implement this PR then and use Nuxt cookie, which is they're depending on a library to parse the cookie on the server and on the client. And I didn't do that. So I tried to provide you with something simpler. And of course, I made some mistakes. So there's one line missing. Anyways, what's happening is first you send the first you send a request. Wow, this is so large. A little bit larger. So first you send a request and it has the cookie. And you can see that this is like Apollo token, and it's having the JSON Web Token. So Nuxt Apollo is taking care of saving the JSON Web Token in the cookie. Then it ends up here. This method is being called. I can parse the headers and get the Apollo token from there, and then save it into the set token. And to prove you that the server-side rendering actually shows me the page depending on my authentication state, I, for example, can search for log out, and there you have the button, log out. So this is the page that is being rendered on the server, and it has the logout button, and I wouldn't see the logout button if I wouldn't be authenticated. I can show you what I had in the what I had before. Okay, is it clear for now what's the problem? Like you send the cookie to the server, server understands, I have to parse the JSON Web Token from there, save it to the store, and render the page depending on that. And if I send an upvote mutation, for example, the JSON Web Token is being added as the header. Does it make sense so far? No questions? I'm always a little bit nervous when I don't hear anything from you back, you know? Okay, that was a sound. That was not someone talking, but okay, nice. It did work or didn't? Okay, cool. That's good. Good to know. I can show you, in order to make it a little bit easier to see, I can show you what I had before. So before that, I was using a plugin. A plugin is being executed on both the client and the server. And it's called Apollo helper and set the token into the store manually. And this would be executed on both client and the server. And since this was working on the client but didn't work on the server, you basically see this. Do you see that? Can you see it? So I'm refreshing the page. I see the logged out page. And then those buttons show up because then the client takes over. And I see those buttons popping up. And this is a phenomenon when the HTML rendered on the server is different from the client. This is something you would see in your console as well. So this is the error message, the precise error message, if the rendered virtual DOM on the server is different from the one on your client. Right? Yuri, can you tell me if you can see that the unauthenticate page shows up first?
You are now unmuted.
Great. And that's because Apollo helper's get token doesn't work as expected on the server. So this is a bug, but it's also a nice it's a cool example how to show differences between server-side rendering and client-side rendering. And they are talking about baling hydration. So hydration or rehydration is the process of the client taking the HTML from the server. Right? So there's a problem with hydration, obviously, because the HTML is different from what the client renders. Right. So watch out for your console. Maybe if I had thought about this before, I could have added a star for you don't see this error message here. Right? So you should make sure that your server rendered HTML matches the HTML that the client is going to render. Okay, we're at the end of the lecture, 5 minutes overtime. This is the last opportunity to ask some questions. Public chat, 12 messages which I haven't read. Please unmute yourself. Please write into the chat. I hope this gives you an idea how this works. I hope this image is now in your mind, that you have this. I always think of this tree, and then I have suddenly this thing somewhere in the background, which is somehow connected to everything. Hopefully you can see what I was explaining with how to use Vuex, how to test Vuex, how to use Vue-Apollo, how to test Vue-Apollo, what can happen or what can go wrong if you have server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Slides from last lecture are not in Moodle. Of course I can upload them, I just forgot. Thank you. Or basically exam queue. Exam questions. No, I upload all the slides, of course. Really, no questions? This was a complicated lecture. Are you kidding me? Or did I was just like overwhelm you with so much content? Is it helpful for your homework? Let me ask it this way. Can some groups give me some feedback if this was helpful for the homework? Did you run into similar problems already? One person is typing. Maybe just one person listened to the lecture after all. Absolutely all of the problems that you described. Good. That's very positive, very, very relaxing. Bumped my head against the wall. Yeah. Good. At least I could help one person. That's making me happy. Well, if there are really no questions anymore, I would say let's call it a day. Or, well, let's not call it a day, but let's finish the lecture and we see each other in the seminars. Yes? It is, I think it's already changed in the LSF. After I received the mail from university administration, I checked in the LSF. And for me, it was showing up as 10th of February. Yes, you can send me, Atanas was asking how to send me the slides. You can send me an email, for example, and I will upload it to Moodle. Good, great. Well, there's one person typing. I'm going to wait for him. In the LSF wasn't a date. Really? For me, there was. Anyways, okay. If you can also reach me with email or write something in the forum if something is unclear. I got the confirmation, another confirmation from the university administration that everything is as expected regarding the date. So I would say I'm going to stop the recording button now and we see each other in the seminar.